Okay, naming the transformations. So these are all your word stuff. So you can be doing compressions, shifts, reflections, left, right, up, down, all those kinds of things. You also need to understand the order. Anything that's a multiply divide is before add, subtract, which means if you had to reflect or compress or stretch, that has to be before a shift. Okay, so this should have 1, 2, 3, 4 things written down. 4 things happen to it. Okay, so we have to talk about the multipliers first. So we can go with the negative thing and the 2. So the negative is a reflection over, you have to figure out which way that is reflecting. So that's an A, so it changes Y. If you change Y, you reflect over the X. And the 2 is in the A position, so it is going to be a vertical stretch by 2. Okay, then you can go after the C and the D. Doesn't matter those 2 orders. So you can say it moves, it shifts to the right 4, and it shifts down 1.
On the test, do you want it like stretched by 2 or would you
Yeah.
want it stretched
I want by 2, yeah. Because I'm going to tell you why on the other one. There's a little bit of confusion on this one. Okay, I'm going to ask how many people did I trick right away on this question. Why did I try to trick you? Anybody see the problem?
Yeah,
Factor out. It has to be like that, and it's not. Okay, so y equals f of 1/4 out. Okay, ready? This is a little tricky. 1/4 times what makes 1/4 x? So 1/4 times x. 1/4 times what gets to 2? 1/4 times what makes 2? 1/4 of what number is 1/4 of 8? Okay, so here when Eli asked, do we have to be specific by numbers? This is one that I want you to specifically say and understand. What physically happens when b is a small number? Do you remember? So I'm going to think, if I don't remember, what do? This is like the math that's happening, right? I'm dividing by 1/4. Well, what else does that actually do? What's the same thing as dividing by 1/4? Timesing by 4. So what would it physically do to a number? Makes it bigger. So we're going to go a horizontal stretch by 4. That's what you physically do. It seems weird to compress something by 1/4, which is like kind of two things negating each other almost. Okay, there's a 100% chance there'll be a spot on your test where I haven't factored out the b, so you have to recognize that. Pretty high odds, 100% chance there's on there. Okay. You have a point, stuff happened to it, what's the new point? So this is you understanding the ABCD thing going on. So can you write me ABCD stuff? So as in, what happens to x? It gets divided by 2 and subtract 3, right? You see the B and the C. Okay, so once you have put your ABCD stuff into the coordinate, figure out the coordinates. So 12 is x. So 12 divided by 2, I'm at 6. 6 minus 3 is 3. And then I put the 5 into here. So 2, 5 is 10. 10 minus 4, 6. Okay, this little symbol, you have to understand what it means. So what does this little negative symbol up there mean? What's the name of this thing in a word?
Inverse.
Inverse, if you forget, you should probably all understand that little symbol is on your calculator right here with a sign, and you've probably heard sine inverse before. So that's the word, but what does inverse mean to do? Remember the rule? Switch. That's what happens with inverse. So that's it. Okay, what do these symbols mean in a word? Absolute value. So absolute is like a distance of something. So what do we know about a distance? It can't be negative distance, right? F of x represents what? Y. Okay, so what's the absolute value of our y? So what's the absolute value of negative 3? Equals 3. Then minus 6 after. Gets me back to actually negative 3. Okay, so this question would be completely different if I did this. What would my value be if I had had that in writing instead? What would you do differently? You would minus 6, which gets me to a negative 9, and then absolute that, which gets me to a positive 9. So that's different, right? They both did the same things. It was all just about order. Okay, this one, you would do ABCD stuff. So figure out where you want to put stuff in your coordinate. Well, this would be a B, and this would be a D. Okay, last one here. Well, first of all, what does this mean in words, this little symbol? 1 over the f of x means to do what as a word? Reciprocal. So flipping, and again, f of x is attacking just the y, so flipping the y. So don't even touch the x. So 6, comma, that number flipped. Okay, so recognizing there's a few ones with symbol, the inverse, the absolute, reciprocal, understand what to do. Okay, now we're going to write an equation. So you don't need to write this, but this is what's going to happen. I'm going to try to figure out an equation, and we're going to see if we have anything going on. Okay, so as we read, we'll see what it changes. We reflected over the y-axis. So we got a negative. So where are you going to put it in? The A spot or the B spot? And you reflect over the y-axis, which A or B, negative? The B. So I'm just going to write that as a note to myself. That's going to have to be negative. Okay, we get horizontally stretched by 3. So first of all, which letter do you attack if you're horizontally stretching something? Also your B. Your B is the one that horizontally does stuff, multipliers. So what number does the B have to be? B have to be? Well, we already know it's negative. And then what kind of number value do we want there? 1/3, yeah. So we need that, we need that. Okay, so next we're shifting 1 right. So which letter does that go to? That would be the C. We need to be right 1. And 4 units up. So that would be the D part. Okay, so here's the final answer. There was my negative and the stretch. Did you guys notice my format? I used the f of x and then I inserted the things into it. So y equals f of x and then the format. Okay, so one question like that on your test. Okay, so now we were given graphs and we have to figure out the equation. Okay, so sometimes people just are wondering what's going on. We have to write an equation for g of x in terms of f of x. So this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to write an equation of g of x in terms of f of x. So that's what this is all about. We're going to write g based on f, which means g would be considered my new graph, and the f would be considered the original. Would that make sense if I say it like that? How we start and what we go to. Okay, so here's my question for you. Looking at f, do you see anything obvious to get to g? And you would probably think of reflections, compressions, and stretches first. Anything jumping out at your eyes right now? Reflection over the x-axis, which is the A. So I'm going to make a note to myself that that has to be negative, and I'm going to do that. So 0, -2 would flip to be there. Okay, there we go. I have reflected it. So this is yellow, it's a reflection. Okay, now look at my yellow graph. What else? Anything we got to look for? Is there any more compression stretches? I think we're done reflecting, right? Has there been anything I've compressed or stretched? What did you think you did? Stretch? Which way are you stretching it? Horizontally? Okay, so for me, like if I look at this space is like 1 and a bit, and it's still 1 and a bit from the horizontal, from the axis. So I don't think I stretched it out.
Vertically compressed.
Vertically compress. So if I look at the vertical space in that zone and the vertical space in that zone, what do you notice? Half, right? Okay, so vertical compress by 2. Okay, now I'm going to do that. So I'm going to draw the height of 2 is now the height of 1. And then I think we match, don't we? We match exactly what we have at the end. Okay, so I put in both the things we talked about. We reflected, and we talked about this vertical compression by 2. Right? That's a half. Okay, number 5. So we had, this was our new graph. Oh, I have to graph the original, which is me having to go backwards. Okay, so this one's a hard one. We have to actually figure out what the original was because it ended like this. Okay, so we took a coordinate, we did stuff to it, and then we ended up at another coordinate. Would you be okay if I wrote down x divided by -1 and 3y? Okay, so what was the original point? So I took an original point, I did this to it, and it landed there. So I have to work my way back to the original. So what did you divide by -1 to get to -4? 4. 3 times what gets you to 0? 3 times 0. What divided by -1 is 0? 0. 3 times what is 6? 2. Something divided by -1 is +1. -1 divided by -1. And 3 times something is 3. Something divided by -1 is 2. So -2. 3 times something is 3. Okay, so let's graph these original points. Oh, yeah, no, that's good. 4, 0. Okay, I also have to understand the reflection and what's going on with this arrow. So think about that you reflected it, so what would the shape and the arrow look like on this reflection? Can you visualize it? So if I took this F and I reflected it and I vertically stretched it, would it look like that? Yeah, that makes sense to me. Okay, 6 is recognizing again what this even does. So inverse, and then you should be understanding what happens to inverses. The X's and Y's make that switch. Okay, so this coordinate, -4, 0, would become over here 0, -4. 0, 6 would become over here 6, 0. 1, 3 would become 3, 1. And then I'm going to do another one. I'm going to go with this 4, 3 would become 3, 4. So do you understand how to connect it, where to put this one arrow that's on? So there's a triangle part and a flat part with an arrow. Do you understand all the other ideas behind inverses? Did you understand what it visually did? It reflected. Do you remember the equation of this line? What's the equation of the most basic line you could have like that? Y equals X. It reflects over that. So it's a diagonal reflection. Do you also remember, if I didn't graph this, what is the range of this? What I drew under my hand, what's the range of the graph under my hand? Without looking at it, just look at this. How can I tell you the range of that other one? What's the range of this one? Without looking at it. How do you get it from the original? The range of this is equal to the domain of this. So what's the domain of this? How would you write the domain of this? How far left does it go? -4 to how far right? Infinity. It goes from -4 to infinity. Is that what your heights do on this one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the range?
Okay, so I might ask you questions with that. You need to understand. They switch. So I might not ask you to graph. I might just say, what's the range of the inverse? Okay, so I see here we have an absolute and we have a down one. Tell me, which one should I do? Should I go absolute and then down, or should I do down and then absolute? The way it looks. You have two things, but what first? Absolute, then down, or down, then absolute? You're going to have to do down. How many people were thinking that? Okay, it's in the bracket, so you got to do it first and then the bracket. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm physically going to draw that. I'm going to go down one. So this one would be -4, -5. I'm going to draw it really lightly. So this intercept at -3, move it down one. -2, height of 3 instead of 4. The y-intercept instead of 2 is 1. this x-intercept at 2 is going to move down 1. 4 comma negative 3. Okay, so there's my down 1. So this question is on your test. It's worth 2 points for getting the order, for getting the transformations. Okay, what do you do? So this is done. How do you absolute something? What's the rule? It either stays or changes. What do you know about distances? If it's a positive distance, just leave it, right? Or 0. So this is going to stay. That's going to be staying. This is going to stay. That stays. All that stays. And then the negative distances, right? Like if you think of a distance, the negative heights need to change. Okay, I also might ask you questions about range, something like that. If you have absoluted everything, what do you know about your range? When you have a range of an absolute, you should never have something with a negative inside your range anymore, right? This one would happen to be 0 to infinity because there's an arrow. Right? Because that makes sense. Now we got rid of all the negatives because we can't have the negatives involved. Okay. Next question has a reciprocal on it. So flipping stuff. Heights. Flip the heights. That's what you're doing. All right, so now the first one I attack is the height of 0. What happens on the flip? How do you draw this number? How do you draw 1 over 0? An asymptote. So a dashed vertical line. What if I just asked you about the equation of the asymptote? Your answer would have been x equals 2, x equals negative 3. Okay, the next thing I go to is a height of 1 or negative 1. Because what happens on the flip of 1? Just stays. So stays. There's 4 coordinates. There's 4 coordinates that stay. Okay, now you have to piece together the shapes. So I would maybe like in the middle section, the top height of 4 is going to have to move to a height of 1/4. So it went from being the top to now the bottom. And what do you do along the asymptotes? You move closer, you don't cross. Okay, I'm going to go to the left section. So the lowest coordinate was -4 height. So it's going to go to -1/4. And it went from being the lowest in that section to now being the highest in that section. Do you notice how that one just has a stopping dot? I don't go on, I stop. And then the right-hand section is different because it has an arrow going down forever. So actually I should say it's going away from 0. Forever it's going away from 0. So then forever I will get closer to 0. And then vice versa, if this section is close to 0, it will move away from 0. And does anybody know one thing I'm now having to add on because of that? This getting closer, closer, closer thing means I now have a, I had to create an asymptote there yet. Okay? So start with the height of 0, start then invariance, and then patterns, close to 0, far from 0. Okay, so in question 8, I'm just going to draw you what our graph looked like. Okay, so this was the number 8. This is what the graph looked like before we drew all over it. What would be the range of the graph if it reflected over that line? So, what does this even mean to you? What's the other way of saying this? This is the exact same thing as saying an inverse. So the range of this new graph would be equal to the domain of the original. Okay, so looking at the original before we drew all over it, what is the domain of this one? How far left was this coordinate right here? -4 to infinity. The domain of this would be the range on the inverse. Okay, number 10, more inverse stuff. Simple for inverse, so again, what's in my head? This is always in my head with inverse, the x and the y, they switch. So we're going to do that. So f of x is the same thing as an original, like a y. So instead of y, I'm going to write x. And instead of x, I'm going to write a y. Okay, so I switched x and y, and now what do you have to do? You have to try to get a new equation with a y equals. So get me this alone. So I'm probably going to add 9. And then I'm going to, I need to get rid of the half, so then I would have to times everything by 2. Okay, I'm not going to leave it like that, or I'm not going to get full points. I'm only going to get 75% on this question. So what's the next thing I have to do to get the 100%? F inverse of x equals, because the question said write an equation for specifically that format. Okay, You might see something additional on the test. You might see something like this. What does that mean? I just have to go one more step further now. I have to input this into that equation. So 2 times -1 plus 18. That's what it means. Just input it into the equation. Okay? So do all this. What does it mean? Switch, solve, but then add a step. Okay, last question of this section. Okay, we have a B, a C, and a D. So I was given the graph of f of x, and I'm going to get a new graph. I have to get the new graph. So here's what I have to do to the coordinates. X divided by -2 plus 3 and y plus 1. I have to do those things to the coordinates. Okay, I'm going to give you a list of the original, so -4, -4. I'm going to go with the -3, 0, -2, 4. I'm going to grab a couple more, probably 0, 2, 2, 0, and 3, -1. Okay, so you take original coordinates, you do the stuff to them, and see where you land. So for me personally, I go through all x's, all y's. I don't do each coordinate because I find it faster. Actually, let's do all the y's because that's fast. Just add 1. So -3, 1, 5, 3, 1, 0. So that's fast if you can just rip all the y's through. Okay, the x's are a little bit more work. Okay, divide by -2 is 2 plus 3, 5. Divide by -2 is 1.5 plus 3, so 4.5. Divide by -2 is 1 plus 3. Divide 0 plus 3. Divide by -2 and you get to -1. And then -1 plus 3. Divide by -2 is -1.5. -1.5 plus 3. So you should also look visually. Do you see that horizontal reflection? Do you see me squishing it together, horizontally compressing it like an accordion? Do the points get all squished together?
Yeah, I see that.
Okay, make sure your arrow is showing me that reflection, pointing in the other way.